the Western powers wanted to divide China in their spheres of interest, in the zones of their own interest. And again, some years later, that is in December 1857, England and France launched a combined attack on China. And it was the beginning of the Second Opium War. The attack was made on very flimsy grounds. In fact, there was a ship called Arrow. It was registered with a British company, but owner of the ship was a Chinese. In the ship there was a British flag. The Chinese police used this ship for arresting some pirates. The British claimed that the British flag had been destroyed by the Chinese intentionally, and for that reason Britain decided to invade China, and the French army also joined the British, and the Second Opium War began when the joint Anglo-French attack took place. As the joint Anglo-French attack took place, China had to do nothing. China this time failed to resist and wanted to come to peace. And as a result of the Second Opium War, the Treaty of Tientsin was signed in June 1858. By the terms and conditions of the Treaty of Tientsin, it was decided that China would open 10 more ports to the European powers. Moreover, the victors wanted that they would appoint some resident ministers in the Chinese capital, Peking. And apart from it, China agreed to pay 4 million taels to England and 2 million taels to France as war indemnity. In the beginning, the Chinese government agreed to comply with the terms and conditions of the Treaty of Tientsin, but ultimately they agreed all the terms, but in one point they hesitated to accept. The Manchu government refused to station any resident minister in the Chinese capital because it was a direct threat to the Chinese sovereignty. They could not accept it. When a strong refusal came from the Chinese authorities, there was again a conflict between the Anglo-French forces and the Chinese forces. There was a place called Taku, and from Taku, the Chinese ports opened fire on a very strong British Navy, inflicting heavy injury on the British Navy. Taku repulse was a severe blow to the British prestige. They could not accept it, and again they decided to invade China, and they stormed Canton. In no time they occupied the Chinese capital Peking. Within a few days, almost entire central China came under the Anglo-French occupation. But at this crucial juncture, another diplomat, Russian diplomat Ignatiev, entered into the scene. Ignatiev pretended himself to be a peacekeeping mediator, and he requested the Anglo-French authorities not to occupy Peking, and at the same time he forced Prince Kung on behalf of China to come to terms with the English and the French, and as a result of which the Convention of Peking was signed on 24th October 1860. Convention of Peking was the last convention which was signed between China and the Western imperialist power. By the terms of the Convention of Peking, England and France ensured all the gains of the Tientsin, including their right to keep resident minister in the Chinese capital Peking. Moreover, French secured the rights of the Catholic missionaries to have and purchase landed property in China. Apart from Hong Kong, the British secured Kowloon Peninsula and other areas in China. External powers like England, France, Russia and United States of America, they were engaged in struggle for more power, more wealth in China, more concessions in China. And entire China was divided into the spheres of influence of several powers. Some area was of British interest, some areas were of French interest, and some areas of Russian interest. Ignatieff mediated, but in the back of his heart, Ignatieff was also interested to have some gains from China in the interest of Russia. And thus, by the Convention of Peking, which was signed on 24th October 1860, the treaty system came to an end and China entered into the treaty system for the second time. An eminent historian, Emmanuel Shu, aptly remarked, beyond doubt, by 1860, ancient civilization, that was China, had been thoroughly defeated and humiliated by the West. China essentially became a semi-colonial power. Now I shall end after ending. What do we mean by semi-colonial status of a country? And in this sense, a comparative analysis between the history of India and its neighboring country China, I think, would not be out of context. India was a British colony, pure and simple. English East India Company came to India. They defeated Sirajuddaulah in the Battle of Plassey in 1757, and within a century, almost all of India came under the British rule. Up to 1857, English East India Company ruled India. After 1857, India directly came under the British rule. There was no sovereign Indian government and everything had been done by the British authorities in India. We lost our independence. But in China, the thing was different. There was always a sovereign government in China, but the sovereignty was there only in name. From 1842, when the Treaty of Nanking had been signed after the First Opium War, to 1911, the Manchu emperors would rule China. By the Republican Revolution of 1911 under Sun Yat-sen, the Manchu rule in China came to an end, but within a few months it had been replaced by the rule of the warlords, and in every occasion we see that there was very loud presence of imperialist powers in China, but not a single imperialist power that remained present in China like that of India. Entire China after the Opium War, and when the treaty system prevailed upon China, entire China had been divided into several spheres of influence of several powers. In fact, in India there was no competitor of British, and by the Carnatic Wars, British had defeated the French and the Dutch had already gone away. It was in the 18th century, everything was over. It was easy for British to have her East India Company to make India her colony. But in China, there was an understanding between the Western imperialist powers. Each and every Western imperialist powers were interested in the Chinese raw materials, in the vast Chinese markets, and also in the finance capital for investing in China. So they came to an understanding, and this understanding continued till the formation of the People's Republic of China in 1949. But there was a sovereign government up to 1949 in China, but the sovereign government was under very strong grip of Western imperialism, sometimes Britain, sometimes France, sometimes America. And there was a new feature towards the late 19th century when Japan emerged as a big power, and after Sino-Japanese War of 1895, Japan also had her interest in China, and during the First World War, Japan also had some area of special interest in China. So this was the history of the beginning of the imperialist activities in China, and China's treaty with Western powers turned China into a semi-colony, and China had to enter into a treaty system which replaced the tribute system which was China practiced to in the Middle Ages.
The French Catholic missionaries who were coming in, were they successful in converting, proselytizing a lot of Chinese people?
Yes, just after the Opium War, there was a great rebellion in China which is compared with our Great Indian Rebellion of 1857, which is popularly known as Ship Mutiny. That is known as the Taiping Revolution. Taiping Revolution broke out at about 1850 and it continued up to 1864. And Taipings had formed a parallel government in China. Many leaders of the Taiping Rebellion were very much influenced by Christianity. They thought if the Manchurian rulers would embrace Christianity, they would accept the teachings of Christ, they would not submit to the Western powers like anything. They did not like Western imperialism, but they liked Christ. They thought that if they could accept Western teaching and Western technique, the humiliation of China could have been avoided. And there was Hang Xiuquan, the most renowned leader of the Taiping. He liked to call himself the younger brother of Jesus Christ, who has come to emancipate the Chinese people. There was influence. And after some years, after 30-35 years, there was another rebellion known as the Boxer Rebellion. The Boxer Rebellion was against the Christian missionaries primarily and against the Western imperialism. By that time they realized that the Christian missionaries had not come to China to civilize them or to persuade their own interest. So the Boxer Rebellion was an outburst against the Christian missionaries.
The Sino-Japanese war that you talked about,
1895.
During that war, what about the other Western powers? Were they supporting China or Japan?
They sat on the fence. They did neither support Japan, they did neither support China. They remained happy with their own spheres of interest. As Japan did not interfere in their spheres of interests, they did not interfere in
But if Japan also joined
then Japan took other places.
Okay.
So, why is it that even with Japan there were many unequal treaties that were being signed?
No. That was signed not after the Opium. That was after 1895. That is not within our...
No, not after 1895. Before the Meiji Restoration, there were unequal treaties.
No. Not with Japan.
No, not China and Japan. Japan and other foreign countries.
Not that unequal treaties. You cannot call that. There is some difference between the Chinese history and Japanese history. Japan was a small market. The imperialist powers, just after the Commodore Perry's expedition, there was something different. They just opened Japan for trade and commerce. They did not enforce anything because they were not interested in that.
Why could Japan resist and then emerge as an imperial power while China, being such a huge territory, could not do that? What was lacking in China?
It is the question of internal history. Japan accepted modernity since 1860s. We are to be a strong nation, we are to be a modern nation, we are to accept a constitutional government so we can cope up with the Western powers. China did not do it. And another thing, China did not believe in private capital. Everything they wanted to make big industries by the imperial capital, government capital. So there were so many rich scholar gentry, rich officials in China, rich men who were family members of the Manchu emperor. They did not want their own money to invest for building industry. The Japan made itself a very modern country after the Meiji Restoration, and they realized that if we do not turn ourselves into a modern country, if we do not equip us with modern military equipments, if we do not take an aggressive stand, if we do not modernize our economy, if we do not modernize our government constitutionally, we cannot, the Western powers should, we will have to face a similar fate of the Chinese. But the Chinese stuck to old imperial government, non-constitutional imperial government, old traditional system of trade and commerce, old traditional system of agriculture, very apathetic to modern industrial development, and so China did not want to be a modern country. Sufferers were the Chinese people, not the government officials. They would lead a very luxurious life throughout the semi-colonial period of China.
So even after the Opium Wars, even after they got defeated and had to pay so much indemnity, the Chinese people still had that sense of superiority about their culture. That's why they were
No, Chinese
averse
people
to
had
change.
not that. Chinese imperial officials had that sense of superiority. In fact, Sun Yat-sen was the first man who led the Republican Revolution 1911, who introduced some element of patriotism and nationalism among the Chinese people. You had to fight against imperialism like anything. You had to fight against feudalism like anything. You had to get yourself emancipated from this semi-feudal, semi-colonial oppression. It was the message of Sun Yat-sen, but he failed. After that, the Chinese Communist Party under Mao Zedong organized a movement of the people. The people were awakened with the communist ideology, and the Communist Party took a leading role to fight imperialism. Here also there is a difference between the Indian history. In the fight against imperialism, the communists were never very forefront in India. But in China, anti-imperialist struggle was mainly led by the Chinese Communist Party under the leadership of Mao Zedong in the 20th century.